So in this volume, I'm sorry, my cat is acting crazy. Ginger, chill. So in this volume, the themes that are explored are a cycle of revenge, family dynamics, and a discussion about social class, who really suffers when governments and authoritarian figures have war, who really gets hurt, and ultimately that's their own people. Marco and Alana, along with Hazel, are on a completely different planet, settled in, and Marco and Alana really struggle with their family dynamics, their roles they play in raising Hazel. For instance, Alana is now the breadwinner. She is working, but she's not really dealing with her mental health issues. Being a veteran, she's not really talking about what's bothering her. And so she uses her job and drugs as an escape rather than communicating with her own husband and family about what's really bothering her. Similarly, with Marco, he struggles with being a man, raising his daughter, taking on a domestic role. I think in a way, Marco feels a bit lost with his position and with his family, and doing so feels like he's not really contributing, even though what he's doing as a stay-at-home parent is really important. Because these two characters are not communicating, they're not really nurturing their family and relationship dynamic, that leaves room for other intrusions to come in. While all this is going on, Isabel continues to be a reminder of how precious life is and all the little petty arguments that Alana and Marco have could really be resolved if they just talk to each other and also try to just appreciate each other, because life's short. With Prince Robot the Force character, that really delves into the politics of things. He is also a character that's really struggling with his mental health. Prince Robert IV neglecting his own mental health leads him to neglect his political and his family duties. So in this volume, ultimately it's Marco, Alana, having their dynamic becoming fractured, and with Prince Robot, it's his duties and his family that also become fractured and bystanders of his lack of being able to just take care of himself. The only story that really has characters come together in this storyline for this comic is the Brand, Gwendolyn, and Sophie, which is a pretty cool way that they come together, but I don't want to really say too much. But it's another dynamic I look forward to in the next volume. But that's about it. That's my review of Saga. If you have any other input about Saga, please let me know. I love that series. So once again, this is like a reread for me. So I just get a chance to kind of delve into it, notice things that maybe I didn't notice before. My favorite part of the comic is probably the fact that this particular comic shows Prince Robot the Force dad, who's the king of the robot kingdom, and he's basically like a giant flat screen TV, and I thought that was pretty cool. So Kobabe is the author and illustrator of this memoir that's very much an evolution of their non-binary and asexual identity, as well as them dealing with autoandrophilia. There's a lot of different talking points the author makes in their memoir, but I appreciate that the author is really doing just that, giving talking points, bringing up issues, but makes it pretty clear throughout the book that they don't have all the answers. For instance, something that the author struggles with from the very beginning is their gender presentation, and as well as their, not just their physical being, but their clothes. And that bumps against what society pressures people into molding themselves into. An example the author provides is when the author goes to get her hair cut and doesn't really like the job that the hairdresser is doing. Air eventually goes to Air sister and has her cut Air hair, because ultimately Air's sister knows them well enough to know what they want from a haircut. The author feels the most themselves. There's self-examination throughout the book, but ultimately I felt like the author knew who they were on a cellular level. It's mostly just society around them gaslighting them and telling them that they don't know who they are in a way. This issue is compounded with the fact that sex education is not inclusive. So when the author struggles to really figure out their sexuality, it seems like they're very stuck, because in sex education there's just not those kind of resources, or those conversations aren't really had. With all the pressures of what society expects from the author and the lack of sex education creating inclusive material, the author turns to their love of literature, and I think that's probably my favorite part of the book. It was just very sweet to see how the author embraced other characters or other real life pop figure in their life that made them feel more themselves. The author also brings up how in the medical community, in medical institutions, there's not quite a sensitivity to complex issues the author faces, and so this creates a lot of painful experiences for the author. And this is another part of the book that I really appreciated the author bringing up, because it's an issue I just wouldn't be aware of, but also there don't seem to be any easy answers to resolution. So in the graphic memoir, there are two sections, one page after the other, that really stuck out to me, and that was page 190 and 191. The author eventually comes around to the idea of pronouns as they learn about how Air could pick out their own pronouns. And I think the issue is with the author asking people to use the pronouns. The author is just coming from a place of feeling like Maia doesn't want to inconvenience other people. And so in the book, the author is talking to her friend, and her friend said, so instead of asking people to do something to make you feel more comfortable, you'd rather just feel a little uncomfortable all the time? You'd rather internalize and carry that discomfort every time someone who loves you misgenders you. And I really love the way that the author's friend put it that way. And in 191, the author creates a metaphor that I thought was really beautiful. And I would equate it to, if you ever watched the show Schitt's Creek, there's a character, David, that explains his sexuality by saying that he dislikes the wine, not the label. And I always thought that was such a great metaphor, but this one is just as good, talking about being non-binary. And so it says, as I ponder a pronoun change, I began to think of genderless as a scale and more as a landscape. Some people are born in the mountains, while others are born by the sea. Some people are happy to live in the place they were born, while others must make a journey to reach the climate in which they can flourish and grow. Between the ocean and the mountains is a wild forest. That is where I want to make my home. And I just thought that was absolutely beautiful. I don't know if you can see that. I don't know. I think that was my favorite section out of the whole book. I just thought it encapsulates how the author feels, how the author wants to be represented, all the while giving someone like me that really doesn't have a lot of understanding. I have plenty of empathy. I just don't always understand certain subjects, and I just felt like this was a really beautiful guide in a way, and I really enjoyed it. All right, everyone, that's the end of my review for Genderqueer. I hope you pick up a copy. I hope one day this book is no longer part of being a banned book. I thought all the information in here was incredibly enlightening. It is graphic in nature, but I felt like all the different graphic moments in this illustrated graphic novel were really warranted for the author to get their points across. So I really feel like the graphic novel format was the best for the author telling this particular story.
Today I'm going to be talking about David Chang's Eat a Peach. Most people know him from his restaurant, Momofuku. I know him from the Netflix show Ugly Delicious. I love culinary food shows, so that's kind of my thing. So this memoir is told in not a linear fashion per se. It kind of jumbles around, but it does start off from this from the author finishing college, landing himself an office job that ultimately he's unhappy in, and it's actually his depression that catapults him towards finding a career in the culinary world. The themes that are discussed in this book are family dynamics, chosen family, mental health, toxic work environment, workaholism, and the evolution of being a chef and the restaurant world. There's a visual technique that the author uses in one of his chapters that's reminiscent of the book House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski, where he uses black ink to tell the current story that he's writing, but then he'll use the word strike option to make it clear what he's unhappy with that he's done in the past, and then he'll use a red text to have a dialogue to talk about his past behaviors. And I feel like this was a really effective technique for the author to be transparent about his past behaviors and take responsibility, reflect on those actions, and then insert a healthier point of view, kind of showing the evolution of him as a person. There are some parts of the books where the storyline will take place around the author and the dynamics that he has with other people in his life. And I felt like I really appreciated that when he is talking about himself, he's very candid, but he's very delicate, and it seems like you could tell he's taking care of the other people that he's writing about in a way that feels, it comes across guarded, but I feel like this is coming from a place of someone that doesn't want to really speak on someone else's behalf and wants to protect the fact that although he's someone writing a book, it's not the other person writing a book. So he tries his best to be candid and just vulnerable from his point of view, while also, I don't know, you could tell like there's something missing, but I felt like I appreciated it because it always seems to be the other person in the story that he's trying to be. I don't know, it is, the word protective comes up to mind the way that I read it. Throughout the book, the author has all these gems that I found, and I think this comes from the fact that the author has a degree in like a particular religious study. So on like page 61, the author writes, "You simply can't rely on common wisdom in the kitchen. Most of it is built on half-truths and outdated assumptions. Be open to every idea." So I feel like the author here and there will say something that is, I feel like it might be unintentionally profound. But for instance, for that quote, I felt as though what he's saying really applies to life and not just a philosophy on how to move around in the kitchen. But with that point, the fact that at times it feels as though he's saying things that are unintentional gems or unintentional insights leads me to my criticism. There's a point that I didn't really know if I was going to talk about, but they're just moments in the book where there are like some head scratchers, and by the time I reached the end of the book, there's just a couple of head scratchers that happened to the point where I realized I'm probably going to have to talk about it in some fashion. While reading the book, I really connected with what Chef Chang and Hucking Baka are saying with their food. For instance, Baka grew up with Mexican food, and Chef Chang grew up with Korean food, Japanese food. He has a French background as far as his formal training. And so I felt like they made it clear that all these foods should be celebrated. When someone makes food, it shouldn't just necessarily have to represent one particular culture. That in life, you're influenced by so many different cultures, and that should also be celebrated. But as I went on reading the book, I felt like some of the elements that the author talked about in his book kind of contradicted what he was trying to say at the same time. As an example, the author wrote a cookbook, and he uses gochujang sauce, which is a fermented chili sauce, in the recipe, but he changes the name to dragon sauce purposefully. And the reason for him doing that is because, well, the way he says it is something like, so he writes in the book, it has the absolutely awful and ridiculous name, Red Dragon Sauce. I knew that lazy people would copy the recipe without bothering to check whether Red Dragon Sauce was a real thing. To this day, I'll see it show up on menus from time to time. It always makes me laugh. So here's the thing. The reason why I find this to be a bit contradictory is that calling gochujang sauce is a very specific choice that he made, and he put it in his own cookbook. And yes, one of the reasons why someone might use the name dragon sauce is because they're lazy, according to him. But I also feel like when you put something out in the world, there's like a responsibility that you have to what you're trying to teach people. And so it's not like it was something that he said in a conversation. He specifically wrote it in his own cookbook and gave it the wrong name? How can he guarantee when someone makes a recipe that requires fermented chili sauce that they're not calling it dragon sauce as an homage to him, because that's what he calls it in the cookbook? I just feel like he's creating something with a scenario in which he only sees a reusing of his teachings as a form of laziness, when I feel like he was the one that put it into the world in the first place. So that was a bit of a head scratcher between what he's trying to say philosophically about, making a dish and it exists and it carries all these different cultures and that should be just as celebrated, but then also creating a sticking point regarding the actual name of a sauce. But then he was the one that put the misinformation out in the world in the first place. It's just like, I don't really understand what he's doing with that. Like, I don't understand the chuckle part of it. I don't know. So that was a little bit of a head scratcher. And again, I didn't think I was going to talk about that. But then later on in the book, in terms of what you bring to the plate, there's a dish, and I couldn't find, I was trying to relook through the book to find this point, but I couldn't find it right now. There's a specific traditional Korean dish that he uses the foundation of that Korean dish with all its tradition, and then recreates it in his own kitchen to sell in his own restaurant, which is fine, that's great. But then in talking about the customer, he says that he finds it funny to think about the customers that are going to eat his food, enjoy that dish, and then go to a traditional Korean restaurant, order that dish, and it's going to be something completely different. So I feel like at times he's laughing at the consumer, which is a little bit, it's disheartening, because I thought the whole point of creating the food that he's making is to create a bridge between cultures and the customer through food. And I thought that was a really beautiful idea, but then he kind of is tearing down that whole idea while laughing at the consumer. I don't know. I thought, wouldn't it be nice if someone came into a restaurant, enjoyed a dish so much that they're gonna want to try it somewhere else? Doesn't that also create a dialogue? Wouldn't I eat something, even if it's completely different, and be interested to learn more about that food and that culture? Why does it warrant a laugh, or almost like looking down at the consumer because they're getting something different somewhere else? Like, it seems like he's laughing at the surprise the customer is going to get. I didn't really understand that, between wanting to connect, but then, with a dragon sauce, it's like, I'm tricking you. Or with a traditional dish that he changed, it's like, isn't it gonna be funny that you're probably not gonna like the original one? I don't know. Those two things kind of didn't really sit well with me, because I just feel like he's contradicting what he's trying to do with his food, and then trying to have some sort of control of the result that's beyond him, right? Because I feel like when you put food out, there's no guarantee how the message is going to be received, right? So I bring this all up to say that those are two little head scratcher moments, until I reached towards the end of the book, where their author talks about a restaurant that failed. It was a chicken restaurant that he opened up, and with his restaurant and his food, he wanted to create a dialogue around racism that people in the Asian diaspora are subjected to. So he gets these posters from iconic films where they have characters that are playing very racist, stereotypical roles, and he's putting him up in his restaurant to create a dialogue about racism. And with his chicken sandwiches, he would have the wrapper of the sandwich say delicious, but it's spelled incorrectly to be as if someone had a particular Asian accent. And so for him, he's doing these things because he actually wants to prompt the consumer of his food to reflect on these very racist stereotypes, right? But in doing so, it's one thing for someone to want to have the conversation, but I don't know if that, it seems like that doesn't really work, and he knows it didn't work in that particular case, and he ended up changing the restaurant and closing it down. And this happens because in the book, and I'm getting to spoiler territory to basically discuss what was my sticking point. In the book, there were like 2 white customers, if I'm correct. Basically, these 2 customers, they buy the sandwich, they eat it, they notice the wrapper, and instead of like questioning or reflecting on how racist it is to make fun of someone's accent, instead they start putting on the accent and doing exactly what he doesn't want, which is to make fun of someone with an accent. I should say with a particular Asian accent, right? And I feel like this somehow seems reminiscent of what he did with the dragon sauce, right? I felt like he's putting something out into the world that is unintentionally reinforcing something negative. With the dragon sauce, it's misinformation. And with the chicken wrappers, I felt like, well, you're just enforcing unintentionally this kind of like racist act. And so I think that's what's a little bit frustrating, because although throughout the book the author discusses mental health, toxic behavior in the workplace, there is a thread going through by the, like towards the end of the book, or he'll reflect on things and he realizes that he's making the connections of where he started at and kind of what went wrong and what he needs to work on. But I felt like by the time we get to the part where he talks about his failed chicken restaurant, I didn't feel like the author was making enough of a connection between what he was doing with the dragon sauce, what he was doing with the discussion between a traditional Korean dish and one that he changes, right? He changes it for his for whatever he's trying to say philosophically, right, about bringing all these cultures together in a dish. Compounded with what happened with a chicken restaurant. I just didn't see him grabbing onto those other elements and saying, well, now I reflect on the dragon sauce, the dish that I made, and it all kind of led to my error with a chicken restaurant. I just didn't see him making those connections. So I don't know if it's that he genuinely doesn't see those connections, or if it just wasn't written that way and it should have been. So I can't even tell if this is like necessarily a literary criticism or if it's like a philosophical criticism. But either way, it seems like he's in conflict between the connections he makes and then I feel like almost sometimes what he actually believes. It's just very contradictory, and it kind of bothered me because, I don't know, it's one thing to see someone necessarily be lazy and make errors. It's another thing to actually contribute to that error. I hope what I just said makes sense, but that was the only thing that really kept sticking out to me in the book. beyond that, I absolutely love the book, and I love that the author really, he embraces in a lot of other parts of the book his contradictions, and how it's through his failures over and over again that he finds success. And that's what I really love about what he writes, that it's not like he came out of the gate knowing what he was doing. It was just constantly through trial and error that he found what works for him, and I really enjoyed it. So I did enjoy the book. I'd say read it. I mean, I have a very brief, minor criticism, but beyond that, everything else I loved. I love the conversation about food. I love how he could talk about a particular philosophy about how a different chef will do a dish, and like throughout the book he has no real he generally feels like his criticism is valid, only to later on feel like, oh, there's something I just didn't understand. He's really willing to take responsibility for, I don't know, how he's behaved in the past. He talks about the Me Too movement and how what needs to change maybe in the culinary industry. I found that really fascinating. I enjoyed that it wasn't quite linear. He does kind of jump around a lot, but I didn't find it confusing. It all seemed valid because it seems like every chapter he is really trying to tackle a particular subject, so that does kind of warrant him jumping around. And this is definitely not your typical memoir, because it's just not about his life lived outside of a culinary world. The culinary world is so much of his own life. It's a big chunk of his life. So it's really ingrained together, and you really learn about the evolution of him coming into his own, creating his own culinary voice. So I'd really recommend you pick up this book. It was a really lovely read, very enlightening about also his struggles with mental health. Today I'm going to be talking about The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. This is a nonfiction memoir, and this author is quite revered in the state of California as well as everywhere else as well. This book focuses on the year that the author's husband died, but that's like the main focus, but it's also about the fact that her daughter was critically ill, and the author themselves faced their own health struggles. Throughout the book, the author focuses on discussing grief and how that's expressed. You know, she discusses how she goes from someone that hasn't been through that, and how she perceived how grief would take place. For instance, she talks about how she thought the worst part of going through that type of scenario is, you know, the funeral. That's supposed to be some ceremony of closure in a way, when it's nothing like that whatsoever. And throughout the book, the author talks about grappling with grief, but I think that actually is her grieving. You know, she's trying to figure out, how do I get through this day by day? And in a way, there's this denial of her husband even being dead. In a way, she holds on to physical items, like let's say his shoes, because if she just holds on to those items, he's not really gone. The author also jumps through happy and sad memories in her life with her family. There are two sections in this book. One is about how she talks about mourning versus grief, and there's a whole other section where I thought that it would be really nice to talk about how beautiful her prose are, that I wanted to go over with you. So on page 143, it It's a whole paragraph. I try to keep my quotes down to a sentence, but sometimes that doesn't really work out. So in the book, she says, "Until now, I had been able only to grieve, not mourn. Grief was passive. Grief happened. Mourning, the act of dealing with grief, required attention. Until now, there had been every urgent reason to obliterate any attention that might otherwise have paid, banish the thought, bring fresh adrenaline to bear on the crisis of the day. I had passed an entire season during which the only words I allowed myself to truly hear were recorded. Welcome to UCLA." So this is such a impactful way to discuss grief versus mourning. Again, she's talking about that level of denial she has to feel just to get through day-to-day life, just to function. And I felt like, I don't know, yeah, I have to say it's just really impactful. And she has a way of saying things without saying she's in pain. You know, it's discussing and exploring how she's trying to get through instead of just saying, "I'm sad," or "I'm hurt," or "this is how I feel." And I feel like so many people could relate to that at some point in your life. You have something that you go through that's so painful that it's like, I can't even acknowledge it. But if she said that so simply, I don't think that it would be as impactful, or that someone could even connect, because then it would be like an how do I say that? An oversimplification of what she's going through. And so I thought that was really incredibly written. Throughout the book, she does just talk about her, again, her day-to-day life within a year, and truly how every moment she's just trying to get through it. Also on page, I want to say page 190, I'm trying to figure out where to start, because this is another section where I feel like it's a big chunk to discuss. So I'm trying to figure out how to cut it shorter. She talks about being a child and how she was trying to understand how to find meaning in life, and she didn't necessarily find it in religion. So she looks for, I would say she looks for meaning in life in hard facts, you know, the natural earth that exists. So for instance, she says, "After a few years of failing to find meaning in the more commonly recommended venues, I learned that I could find it in geology. So I did. This in turn enabled me to find meaning in the Episcopal Litany, most acutely in the words, 'As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end,' which I interpreted as a literal description of the constant changing of the earth, the unending erosion of the shores and mountains, the inexorable shifting of the geological structures that could throw up mountains and islands and could just as reliably take them away. I found earthquakes, even when I was in them, deeply satisfying, abruptly revealed evidence of the scheme in action. That the scheme could destroy the works of man might be a personal regret, but remained, in the larger picture I had come to recognize, a matter of abiding indifference. No eye was on the sparrow, no one was watching me. As it was in the beginning, it now and ever shall be, world without end." So what I glean from this is that she takes comfort in the tangible. And when she talks about there's no eye of the sparrow, no one's watching her, I also think that connects to her not really being able to connect with religion, that she doesn't believe in some intangible God or religion. And further on when you read, she talks about how she found meaning, which is what she's really trying to get at, in having a family and the routine having a family brings to her. So I felt like as she's discussing that, that makes the loss of her husband that much more painful and a fractured experience, because that's just really tearing apart her world, her ability to have meaning and move throughout life, which is so interesting because, again, she's connecting it all the way back to her childhood and how this was it for her. This was her finding meaning in living with her family, in the patterns and the rituals that we place to make life happen, you know. So I like this book. I didn't love it. The only critique I have, which is, I mean, it's hard to see I have a critique about someone that's so revered. And this is such a personal account of a painful time in her life. So the only critique I have, which is probably also why she's so beloved, is that at times the way she writes, although it's very clear, it sounds at times as if she's reporting the information instead of experiencing it at times. And I think she maybe have done that because she's just trying to be clear about what happened. But at times that reporter sensibility that she has disconnects the emotional experience, I think. And in doing so could make the tone of it sometimes come off like a little bit cold. I don't know. That's the only sense I got from it. And it's not something that I felt throughout the book. There are just certain parts where I felt like, yeah, like she's disconnected. But then again, I don't know if I'm wrong. Maybe she had to be, you know, this is such a touching and painful and terrible time in her life. Maybe in writing it, she had to disconnect that way just to express what she went through. So yeah, liked it, didn't love it. I mean, it's also really beautiful just to study her prose and how she uses metaphor to express even her beliefs. Like I said, like no eye on the raven. I thought that was really incredible. I read it a couple of times because I just wanted to make sure that I was understanding what she was trying to say. But I think it comes off clearly. But I just thought that was so beautiful. And I just keep thinking that in some ways, I don't know if I'm going too far with it, as a reader does sometimes, but I feel like when she's saying she's looking for meaning in life and how she doesn't believe that there's a God, I feel like she puts all her belief in her family, and then like when you lose that, her husband, and at the time her daughter was still alive, so I just felt like that's like losing your whole world. Your world's being shattered. What you believed in, it's like almost like saying, well, if I find meaning in this is my God, right? And then you lose that, and then where do you go from there? At least that's kind of how I started to interpret it, but maybe I'm going too far. Anyway, so I would say, yeah, definitely pick up this book. I mean, so many people love it. Even when I bought it from the downtown bookstore, the Last Bookstore, I think it's called. I mean, it's huge. A lot of people go there, almost like a tourist destination because it's so really beautiful. Anyways, I'm going off on a tangent. The cashier even saw that I had this book when I went to go purchase it, and he immediately gasped. He was like, "Oh, that book." So yeah, so I'm sure there's going to be people that I think love this book more than I did. And it's definitely also a book that I'm going to want to pick up again and take more time to analyze the material. This month was just a little bit crazy for me. My daughter went back to school, and I live in Los Angeles, California, and we're notorious for really terrible traffic. So trying to squeeze in time amongst all the other preparation that goes on during my daughter's school year is kind of crazy. I kind of switched also to reading audio book hybrid with reading the physical book. Actually, I should say something about that. I was reading this. I think I enjoyed reading it myself. I did at some point have to switch to the audiobook. I wasn't a huge fan of the person that read the book. I think I pictured somebody else in my head reading it. It just, the voice in the audiobook was a little bit too light and airy. And there's this musical technique that happened at the end of every chapter, and that's like a melody would go on at the end of every chapter, and I don't know what that was supposed to signal. Was it to signal not just the end of the chapter, but how the character is mourning? Because it didn't fit well, it didn't pair well with the narrative. It almost seemed whimsical, and I think that kind of threw off or countered what's being said. So there's also that critique. I wasn't a huge fan of the audiobook anyways, but yes, I liked it, didn't loved it, but then again, I've also read a lot of great books this month, and so this wasn't necessarily at the top of the ones that I loved, but I would still recommend it. Today I'm going to be reviewing We Were Dreamers by Simu Liu. He's known for being Shang-Chi in Marvel's superhero movie, but also I've seen him in Kim's Convenience, which is on Netflix and originated at a Canadian network, the CDC, I believe. Something like that. Gosh, where do I start? I absolutely love this memoir. I will say first off that what translates well in this book, which anyone that is a fan of the author comes across, is that he has so much love for his family and his community. Now that he's done Shang-Chi, he has opportunities to do commercials, but instead of it being like the standard, I'm doing an automobile commercial, I'm doing a cell phone commercial, it doesn't center around the author looking cool or individualistic. For instance, he did this like car commercial, and it's about him finding the right car for his parents. And then he did like a cell phone commercial where it's like about him acting for the commercial, but his parents are critiquing his performance the whole time. And it's really cute. And I just feel like he just seems like a family oriented person, and that translates well into the book because it is titled We Were Dreamers. This is not, I don't know, your standard memoir written by a celebrity where they decide to excavate the self. This is so much more than that. This is about how his rise to a successful acting career really hinged on the people before him, his parents and his grandparents, and everything that they went through. So I mean, that was top tier why I love this book. The book is broken up into 3 acts, 1, 2, and 3, very much like a play. The author makes plenty of pop culture references, which just had me laughing throughout the book because they're just really adorable. He has like a very quirky sense of humor, and that also translates well. I think that's also what really stood out as far as his portrayal of the character of Shang-Chi as just his like quirky sensibility. And what else? In the book, for instance, he compares or kind of uses like a similarity between the rapper Eminem and his own rise to his mother taking this standardized, really hard government test just to get, I think, oh gosh, I'm already forgetting, access or to be granted to go to college. And I don't know, it was really funny. It's said well in the book. I don't want to really quote that here, but okay, so we're going to go back to the Act 1, 2, and 3. Act 1 is about him being raised in China by his grandparents, the struggles that his grandparents, when they were younger, before he even came around, what they had to do to survive, and also what his parents had to do to get somewhere academically to better their lives. So it's definitely meant to give us perspective on what they had to do to eventually leave China and establish themselves in Canada. And in doing so, later on you realize that is very much the sticking point of why later on, when Simu is like a teenager, why him and his parents tend to clash so much. And it really kind of just sets out to explain the clash between generations, between his parents' generation and his, and all the hard work that they do, and the pressure that comes with it, right? When you want better for the next generation, there's this expectation of what they should accomplish, and kind of how that roots in their conflict with each other. So that's the first act. The second act is, again, like the conflict with him and his parents, and trying to figure out what he wants to do with his life. And then it also explores his life as an accountant, which he was unhappy with. And then the third act goes into him really taking acting seriously and really trying to make that a career path for him. It's really a beautifully written book that has like a strong sense of voice. And I appreciate that the author doesn't shy away from talking about the bigotry his family faced. And he also frames it in the way that he talks about the friendly stereotype Canada has versus reality. But he also touches upon the kindness of strangers that have come across in his family's life, which I really loved. All right, you know what? I was looking for something in particular to quote that kind of creates a good example of the thread throughout the book. But instead, I wanted to read to you how the author was talking about when he was on Kim's Convenience. Although the show started out strong in terms of writing, over time he felt like some of the characters were kind of written in a way that was two-dimensional, and there wasn't any representation really in the writing room, and that was very problematic. And so he wrote, when he brought this up, "You owe that show everything. Put your head down and show some gratitude." There's so much I could say about that in terms of, you know, just a cycle that's being created to hold others down and control others. But instead, I'm gonna just like focus on the positive and say how much of a role model of the author being someone I admire, because he really speaks up even though he doesn't know what the outcome's going to be. He really seems to be a person that will just like point things out, even if it's uncomfortable to hear, and kind of circling back to how I said earlier on that he just seems like the type of person that really cares about his family and community. That's again translated really well in this book because, you know, especially during this pandemic, I probably spend way too much time watching YouTube videos, but he goes on and he'll mention like working on a web series for Wong Fu, and I was just so excited, I guess, to just see him champion other people doing their work, and him bringing them up, him, you know, making a conscious decision to bring up the people that he's worked with. And I feel like that's a form of uplifting others, you know, is to basically, even if he didn't mean it in this way, I felt like he was like giving a shout out to these other incredible people that he's worked with. And I also like, this is totally not important, that he talks about boba tea, because on a personal note, I moved around a lot, but like a chunk of my life I lived in an area that had like a slew, especially my teenage years, of like boba shops. So that's like my go-to. And now where I live in Los Angeles, I'm still somewhat near Koreatown, so there's plenty of boba places there, and I'm always stopping by on my way to pick up my daughter some sort of boba tea. So that's totally not important to reviewing the book, but I just got excited that someone was like, you know, bringing it up, you know, bringing the representation. So I thought that was kind of cool. Anyways, I would just say that I really enjoyed this book, and I feel like anybody that likes memoirs will also like this memoir. It's not like what you might think it is when you see him on the cover. Maybe you think it's just going to be like some celebrity memoir, but it really isn't. It's really about him and his entire family, you know, and it's just really beautifully told. And what else could I say? I don't really have a critique. I just enjoyed this book so much. I would just say I would kind of have liked it if he had his parents on the cover with him. That would have been so cool, but I get it. It's his memoir, but I just think that would have been kind of cool. The other thing is, he does talk about being an accountant, and at some point in that section, it does feel like a little bit of a lull. So I did have to, how do I say it? I did have to kind of push through that section, but that's it. Besides that, the entire book is great. And the fact that I felt like that section felt a little bit like a lull, like a little bit slow, might just be because he wasn't happy at that time. And that just translates really well to the reader. So what else could I say? I did have to, around chapter 15, switch to audiobook. I originally started reading this to my daughter, so that's why it took me so long to finish the book. I started reading that in July, and I finally finished it recently at the beginning of August. And that's because once my daughter's school started, and I tried reading to her at night, after I read to her for like a chapter, she just fell asleep. So I kept trying to read to her, and this wasn't going to happen. So I switched to the audiobook just to kind of like, okay, let me hurry up and finish this book. And I enjoyed it so much more. At some point, I'm going to want to I'm going to want to listen to the audiobook again, because when he's actually reading it, it actually sounds better. And typically when I'm reading an audiobook, it sounds better reading it than the audiobook. It's pretty rare. The only other audiobook that I've listened to this year that really blew my self-reading out of the water was, what was it? Saigon by Phu Tran. That book was incredible. And so his audiobook, Simu Liu's audiobook, which he reads himself, really blew my reading out of the water. I think just because he has such a strong voice in the book, that also translates well to his audiobook and seems just as entertaining. So anyways, either format would be great to read. I definitely say pick it up. And that's it for my review. I can't think of anything else. All right, everyone, I finally made it to my July wrap up. This is what I got through, except for We Were Dreamers and The Year of Magical Thinking. A little bit I read in August because I just time constraints and a couple of other things. But yeah, this is what I got through. I have a spot to put these, but my cat's now perching on my spot. So I'm trying to think about a couple of afterthoughts. I felt like every single book, whether it's The Year of Magical Thinking, Genderqueer, Eat a Peach, We Were Dreamers, or Saga, which was volume 4, there's a connective thread through all of them, and I'd have to say that's mental health. You know, whether it's mourning or if it's Genderqueer by Maia Kobabe, who explores the turmoil they went through trying to figure out their own gender identity and sexuality, with David Chang, who has bipolar disorder. And even I'd want to say We Were Dreamers, I don't think in terms of necessarily mental illness, but mental health and how his relationship with his parents really affected, I want to say, everyone, and maybe also in a way in We Were Dreamers, maybe also generational trauma in a way. I don't know. I feel like there's a connection there with that. And with Saga, I want to say it's the military, or the veterans as well as active military, that are really harmed by the effects of war, and not dealing with their own mental health leads to mental illness. And I really appreciated that was like a coincidental thread throughout the entire book. Look at my notes. Also, oh yeah, I think every single one of these books, I could be wrong, explores found family in a way, as well as except for Joan Didion's book, I feel like all the other books kind of focused on found family and family dynamics, which is heavily kind of explored in We Were Dreamers and Saga. And I would also say Genderqueer, as well as David Chang's Eat a Peach. I felt like that's kind of found family, but through the culinary world. And also, let me see. Another aspect of all these books that I found coincidentally all connected the books was inner turmoil, but I think they could also be kind of linked to the mental health conversation. So I was trying to think of what I thought about all these books by the end. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just rank every single book I read this month. I have to say that my top pick would be We Were Dreamers. I didn't have not one critique about this book. I really loved it. I know I'm a fan of the author, but what he wrote in here was just so touching, encouraging, funny, and I would like to say it's a quick read, but I just happened to take a little bit longer just due to time constraints. But again, this is a great read, an easy read as well. And I appreciate the perspective that the author provides, especially when he's actually challenging some of what our American landscape has maybe perceived, or maybe like our media, the news organizations have, how they represent China and what he takes issues with that. And also exploring like stereotypes in Canada as well as racism. Just the fact that he's having those conversations, I just really appreciated it. Anyway, so I don't want to get too repetitive, but I really love this book. This is like my top #1 pick of the month. My second would be Genderqueer. It's such a bummer that this is a banned book. It is a graphic novel and therefore graphic in nature, but I felt like this was a perfect medium for the author to explore things that sometimes I feel like it's really hard to put into words. And so that balance between words and imagery expresses more of a clear narrative and really what they're trying to say about gender. So I really love this book. This would be my second pick. My third would be David Chang's Eat a Peach. I feel like this is one of those books where I read it, and although I definitely felt like I had more criticism of a couple of aspects of this book than I've had of any book I've read this year, it's still incredibly engaging, and it is a memoir, so who am I to critique it? And I love his honesty. I love the messiness. Even though the narrative seems to be a bit jumbled up, I think I also enjoyed that because it almost seemed like an expression of the author's personality, whether they intended it or not. So this is my #3 pick. And the fourth ranking would be Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking. I like this book. Again, I didn't love it. It is about a profoundly painful experience in the author's life, a year in the author's life, but also I think ultimately it's that reporting type quality of the narrative at times that took me out. So I wasn't as engaged at times as I was with all the other memoirs I read this month. And last but not least, I will not rank Saga because Saga is just has such a special place in my heart. So that goes without saying. This is just a separate reread. I'm reading one volume every month, so I'm not going to rank this. So yeah, sorry, Joan Didion, you're at the bottom. But yeah, out of all these books, I mean, I really loved all of them in their own way. I'm really glad that I read memoirs that are so absolutely varying in each telling of the story. You know, We Were Dreamers was told in a chronological way. Genderqueer being a graphic novel. David Chang's Eat a Peach is not chronological at all, but more tackling different subjects the author wants to explore about his own life that's very much connected to his professional life since he's a chef. And Joan Didion's is also a memoir, but it's also focusing on only 1 year of her life. So I thought that was just some really creative ways to tackle the memoir. So yeah, that's it. I don't think I have anything else to say about these. They're all worth reading. And that's it. I guess I'll see you later.